Hi, it's Mr. Mullaney. I'm talking to you today about Native American resistance. We're talking about the early 1800s as the United States is becoming more entrenched as a country and how Native Americans handle this ongoing issue. This deck of slides is designed by my student teacher, Mr. Boyle. Thank you, Mr. Boyle. All right, so decisions. So there are ongoing disputes, and Native Americans have to decide how they're going to deal with the United States. Some choices. They could accept white culture. They could try to blend the two cultures. They could decide to go only Native American tradition and culture, or they could try to fight militarily. And so you have a nice, I like the way Mr. Boyle did this. You have a nice, so this would be the absolute agreeing to what the whites want to completely opposing them. So your option for accepting white culture. So some did this. Little Turtle was one of the Native American leaders who goes down this path. He lives with white settlers. He has payments from the government. He gradually adopts some of their customs. At one time, though, Little Turtle did fight the settlers. Blending the cultures. This happened with the Senecas in New York. So the Senecas were forced to live on a reservation, and there was a man named Handsome Lake who called for a rebirth of Seneca culture that would mix in white culture. They had Native American rituals, but they had white beliefs about land, agriculture, and family life. Do recall that we learned earlier in this year that whites and natives disagreed about land as far as land ownership. Europeans obviously believed in it. It was a concept that was non-existent to Native Americans. Returning to Native traditions. So Kawada, I'm going to try that. Kawada, the prophet, strongly opposes assimilation. Assimilation is where a smaller culture decides to adopt the dominant culture's practices. All right. So he established Prophetstown, and they have a warlike attitude towards the Americans. He's aided by his brother Tecumseh. What happens is they go to the governor of Indiana, who happens to be a man named William Henry Harrison, and says, look, if these settlers keep purchasing our land, it's going to lead to a war. Harrison decides to act first. He sends 1,000 men to Prophetstown, and you get the Battle of Tippecanoe. It lasts 2 hours. Native Americans' morale is crushed into defeat, and a few days later, Prophetstown is burned down to the ground. We will hear about the Battle of Tippecanoe later in the course, not much later, but soon, but we will hear about it again. And this here is a map that Mr. Boyle found that shows Native American reservations in the United States. Pretty sure this is today. There are some images from them. I'm going to put in the summary a link to Aaron Huey's TED Ed talk about America's Native Prisoners of War, the Native Americans. Talk about the legacy of this, about how awful time has been and how awful this country has been, more so this country than time. That to Native Americans. So that will be in the links. You should really take a look at that. So that's a lesson recap of our lesson about Native Americans, early 1800s. Thank you, Mr. Boyle, for the deck of slides.